Good afternoon and welcome to an EAS Consulting Group webinar on supplier qualifications for dietary supplements presented by EAS Consulting Group independent consultant Aisha Siddiqui. EAS, a member of the certified group of companies, is a global leader in regulatory solutions for industries regulated by FDA. Our network of over 150 independent advisors and consultants enables EAS to provide comprehensive consulting, training, and auditing services, ensuring proactive regulatory compliance. From strategic product development, GMP compliance, assistance with labeling, and more, EAS offers the detailed knowledge and experience that your company requires. Today's presenter is Aisha Siddiqui. Aisha has nearly 15 years of industry experience with FDA regulatory requirements pertaining to good manufacturing practices and dietary supplements. She is an expert in quality assurance standards, development and process improvement, product development and life cycle methodologies, supplier management, quality management processes. Aisha has a documented history of results and synergies in fast-changing environments, including matrix relationships within global quality, supply chain, regulatory, and R&D, as well as an extensive background in FDA good laboratory practices. During the webinar, you may ask any questions by typing them into the questions box, and we will save all questions for the end. With that, I will say thank you for joining us, and we'll turn the presentation over to Aisha.
All right. Hello, everybody. Welcome to our EAS webinar on supplier qualification. I just wanted to say thank you very much for taking the time and joining this webinar with us. And today's topic on supplier qualification would include the 4 areas where we will discuss the regulatory requirements as per 21 CFR 111 that are applicable to supplier qualification program. We will also discuss about the applicability of FSVP, the Foreign Supplier Verification Program, to dietary supplements. An overview of what your supplier qualification program should look like based on the requirements and also industry best practices. And lastly, we will cover the FDA Temporary Policies for FSVP compliance during the COVID-19 pandemic. So you may ask, why supplier qualification? Well, the best way to describe is that, you want to make sure that as the owner of the brand, you are selecting suppliers for your manufacturing operations that have the right GMP standards. Because if something does go wrong, God forbid, your regulators won't allow you to blame one another and push off the blame just because you did not do the work yourself. So having said that, it is very, very important that when you use suppliers or contract manufacturers, that you understand that they are the right partners for you, that they have the right compliance, because they will be providing you materials or producing products for you. The FDA regulations that are specific to supplier qualifications are kind of driven by the specification requirements. So when we look at 21 CFR 111 under subpart E, section 111.70, 73, and 75, the FDA requires the establishment of component specifications. When we say component, the FDA generally means that it's the dietary ingredients. That's your raw materials that you're purchasing. So you must develop specifications that meet the identity, purity, strength, composition, and limits of potential contaminants. And then the FDA requires that you must perform testing to determine whether those specifications have been met upon receipt of every shipment of the material. So that's basically the requirements for the specifications for dietary ingredients under 21 CFR 111. Now, as I mentioned to you earlier, the supplier qualification program requirements go hand in hand with the specification requirements. So when we still look at the subpart E under 111.75, FDA clearly states that, if you want to rely on a certificate of analysis from a supplier of your dietary ingredient that you receive, you must first qualify the supplier by establishing the reliability of the supplier's CFA through confirmation of the results of the supplier's test. You should maintain documentation of how you qualified the supplier, and then you periodically reconfirm the supplier's CFA. And you quality control personnel review and approve this documentation that's setting forth the basis for your qualification and requalification of any supplier. So this is the exact verbiage that's coming out from the regulation under 111.75. So now that we have an understanding of why it's required and what does it kind of like supplement with, we'll cover the FSVP requirements before we jump into what your supplier qualification program should look like. So applicability of the foreign supplier verification program to dietary supplements. Mostly the standard requirements that are under FSVP, such as your hazard analysis, supply chain programs, all of those do not apply when you are importing a dietary supplement component, AKA your raw material, your ingredient, if it meets the specifications established in accordance with dietary supplement CGMPs. So under 21 CFR 1, subpart L, section 1.511A, it states that if you are required to establish specifications of a food that is a dietary supplement or a dietary supplement component, so that's talking about your finished good and it's talking about your raw ingredient, and you determine that the specifications you have established are met for such food, then for that food, you must comply with the requirements in 1.503 and 1.509, but you are not required to comply with the other requirements under the FSVP. So there's pretty much two requirements, right? So we previously spoke about what's required under 21 CFR 111, and now we talked about what's required under the FSVP for dietary supplements. So there's two sections, which is 503 and 509, that we need to comply by with if we're importing a food that is a dietary supplement or a dietary ingredient. All other requirements are not applicable to dietary supplements. Okay, so when we look at the details of what's really under 503, okay, hold on a second. Can you guys hear us okay? I just see a message from somebody stating that the microphone's not working well. Amy, can you hear me okay?
I can hear you, but there is a lot of feedback. I don't know if you're using a microphone with a cord, but it almost sounds like the cord is wiggling around a little bit.
Okay, let's see if we can move this a little bit. Is that better now?
It sounds great. Yep, I'll go back on mute.
Perfect, thank you. Okay, sorry about that technical difficulty, folks. All right, so we'll go back to the FSVP requirement. As I was stating, the requirement under 1.503, which is within the 21 CFR Part 1, subsection L, the two requirements that are there is that it's the qualified individual requirement, which basically just states that a qualified individual must develop the FSVP program and should have the education, training, or experience necessary to perform their assigned activities. The second requirement under that is the qualified auditor requirement, which states that a qualified auditor must have the technical expertise obtained through education, training, or experience to perform the auditing function. So these are applicable to dietary supplements under 1.503. Basically, what that means is, you know, when you write your supplier qualification program, the unit that's responsible, and primarily that's done through your quality unit, they should be the right and appropriate people with the education, experience, or training to write those programs for you. And if there is auditing needed, that they have the right training or experience to perform that function. Okay, so the second requirement was the 1.509, which states that, you know, it talks about the US Customs and Borders where we are receiving the product. and it primarily has to do with the identification of the importer. So if we are importing product from international suppliers, then for every food, for every line entry of food offered for importation into the United States, we must recognize a importer by having their unique facility identifier, their electronic mail address, and their name when filing them electronically with the US Customs and Border Protection. And then for international manufacturers who do not have, they're the owners and they're outside of the United States, then they must also designate a US agent or representative as the importer of the food. The US agent or representative is then the party that the FDA would communicate with in case there are questions or concerns or any other communication that happens with the FDA. That US agent then represents the foreign manufacturer. Okay, so now that we know what are the requirements per the regulations under 21 CFR 111 and under FSVP that are applicable to dietary supplements, let's talk into a little bit detail about what a supplier qualification should look like. Definitely, you should have a written standard operating procedure for qualifying your suppliers. Your SOP should include steps that you take for qualification and the steps you would take for requalification. Your SOP should also detail the documentation that's required as you are doing the qualifications for each of your suppliers. What documents are you going to gather? What documents are you going to create? And what are you going to keep on file? Your SOP should also describe the steps for how do you monitor the ongoing performance of your qualified suppliers. And then it has to be approved by your quality unit. So in essence, your supplier qualification program generally involves it's a phased approach. And it's primarily starting or comprises of a supplier questionnaire where you ask questions around the material that you're purchasing, where you're also asking about the quality systems that your supplier has in place. You develop this questionnaire and then you forward it out to your suppliers to fill that out. After the questionnaire is completed, you perform a risk assessment, a desk audit by doing a review of those documents that you have received from the supplier. And then based on the risk, there might be a potential for an on-site audit. And then once all of those 3 steps are done, going back to the regulatory requirement, which is the COA Confirmation Testing, your program should generally include that as well in your supplier qualification program. And then lastly, you should also talk about periodic requalifications and periodic COA confirmation testing within your SOP for supplier qualification.
Aisha, I'm sorry, real quick. The feedback is kind of coming back again.
Oh, okay.
Sorry.
No worries. Okay, hold on. How's it now?
Sounds good.
Okay, it seems like I need to just bend forward right close to my laptop and speak, and I think it's working out fine. Okay, all right, so we'll go back. So, so at minimum, your component suppliers must adhere to the CGMPs for food, which is 21 CFR 111 GMPs. However, there are very substantial differences between 21 CFR 117 and 111 that should be addressed and ensure that your component suppliers are appropriately meeting the needs of the component users. So next, what we'll do is we'll actually go into a little bit of detail of what each of these steps should incorporate, or what is your objective for each of these steps and what should be the outcome of each of the steps. Okay. So under your supplier qualification step, your objective is to obtain enough information about your suppliers to perform a preliminary risk assessment of their quality management system as well as their component that they are supplying to you. So in this stage, you gather relevant documentation regarding your component or your supplier. And these documents may include your CFA for the component that you're purchasing, the quality system SOPs based on the questions, based on the systems you're asking about. And then it also should include regulatory history, such as FDA inspection reports, enforcement reports, any warning letters, any list of recalls or safety alerts, and lastly, third-party certifications that they might have. Now, I do want to highlight the fact that, we sometimes just rely on third-party certifications. If a supplier has that, the point here I'm trying to make is that it should be one of the aspects, but not the only aspect to see if a supplier has a third-party certification. They're generally granted a qualified status. That should not be done. So once you've gathered enough information via the SQQ or the Supplier Questionnaire, the next step is the review of that questionnaire, also known as the risk assessment or the desk audit. So the objective of this step is to really assess the QMS and determine compliance with applicable GMPs and other standards. So you want to make sure that their systems they have in place, are they compliant with the regulatory GMP requirements? This step actually helps fulfill the requirement for supplier qualification that then can justify the reliance on the supplier's CFA. All component suppliers should have a formal quality management system. Some basic elements of a quality management system include the following. The management oversight of quality, so you want to assess that. You want to assess the facility and equipment operating systems. You also want to assess how the material management systems are in place and operating at the supplier. What are their production and control systems? How are their packaging and label systems working, and laboratory control systems? So these are basic elements, but there are obviously, you can go into details of all of those, or if you want to really go into details during a questionnaire, you want to make sure that all the aspects that are described in different subparts of 21 CFR 111, you're assessing those. Now, one of the outcomes of the review of the supplier questionnaire, AKA your desk audit, you're determining the risk. You're determining based on this desk audit, whether the supplier has the right procedures in place, are they compliant, are they lacking systems, and one thing I would highlight is that make sure your questionnaires are not just a simple yes or no, because if the supplier answers yes or no questions, especially for the yeses, there is no way for you to assess unless you've really looked at a procedure. So you should ask for detailed descriptions of their process. And, ideally, you want to request the SOPs so you can review them and make sure that they're adequate and really assess the compliance of their systems. So once you've done that, based on the risk, you might decide whether you need an on-site audit or the supplier has systems in place that are satisfactory and it gives you enough confidence in your suppliers that you can go ahead and skip the on-site audit. Now, I do want to mention the fact that, obviously, when you do an on-site audit, there's nothing better than that. It gives you a lot more information and you're there. You're really literally on-site assessing it rather than just reviewing an SOP. So it's preferred that you do that. But however, if you feel confident via the SQQ review, desk audit, you can skip the on-site audit piece. But it's totally dependent and should be dependent on your risk. So your paper audits do not obviously provide the same level of detail or information that you can get by doing on-site audits. And the appropriate risk-based supplier qualification program should be based on the principle that most of your component supplier manufacturing facilities should be audited with some predetermined frequency. These on-site audits should be facility specific, and your reports that you generate can serve as your backup support for your reduced component testing that is reliance on the component CFA. So you remember all of the work that we're doing is primarily because we don't want to do testing on every single lot based on the specification we developed. And if we want to go to reduced testing and rely on the supplier CFA, we must have the right programs in place. And the more solid your program is, the more solid your backup is when you are showing to the FDA what your qualification program includes. Your audits can be performed by the customer of the component. So you can have your own teams that have the right education or training to perform the audit, as we covered in 21 CFR 1. Or you can have independent third-party certification groups that can do the audit on your behalf, or any independent consulting firm that can perform the audits on your behalf. Under the CFA confirmation testing, so again, I'm going to reiterate what the regulations stated in 21 CFR .75, that part A to 2, that in order to rely on the component CFA, the component user must verify the minimum required information, which is your test results, your spec limits, and methods on the CFA. So this is exactly the snippet that we've taken out from the regulation, and it reads as, you must establish the reliability of the supplier's certificate of analysis through confirmation of the results of the supplier's test or examination. The certificate of analysis includes a description of the test or examination method used, the limits of the test or examinations, and the actual results of the test or examinations. So here, what we really want to highlight is, you want to make sure that the CFAs also you're getting from your suppliers at minimum include this information. I have come across CFAs where, it's either it's more of like a product technical sheet and there is no actual test results reported, or there's test methods missing. So you want to make sure that you have the limits, you have the test methods identified, and then you also have the actual results reported for those specific lots on your CFA. The scope, the amount of samples, and the frequency of the CFA confirmation testing will depend on the risk posed by the component and the supplier. So this should all be included as part of your supplier qualification program, that when you do talk about CFA confirmation testing, generally based on different risk levels, you would have defined number of frequencies for CFA confirmation testing. So under the CFA confirmation testing program, your testing must be performed to confirm the test results from the component supplier CFA that pertain to the component specifications you have established under the dietary supplement manufacturer guidelines, or the component per the requirements listed in 111.75. So if you go back, we talked about the 5 categories, which is the identity, purity, strength, composition, and limits of potential contaminants. And all of those areas, if you're going to go into reduced testing besides the identity testing, which you have to do regardless on every lot, for the rest of them, if you go on any type of reduced testing program, you must do the confirmation testing on the CFA. So now that we've covered the 4 steps, right? So we started with the supplier questionnaire, then we went into the risk assessment / your desk audit. Then based on the risk, you might decide to audit your supplier. And then after that, you go into your CFA confirmation testing. Let's talk about periodic requalification, right? So after all of that steps, you will have either a qualified supplier or a non-qualified. And let's say for this discussion, we have a qualified supplier. Your procedure must now then talk about how often are you going to requalify your supplier? Because again, that's also a regulatory requirement. So your suppliers, you need to periodically requalify the supplier if you rely on their CFA results, and your CFA must be reconfirmed on a periodic basis as well. So it's not just the COA confirmation, but really repeating the whole cycle of qualification of your supplier should have a defined frequency. Again, your scope and frequency of requalification would depend on the risk that's posed by the supplier or the component itself. And then you would also have the aspect of your supplier performance. So when you are looking at their performance, based on how they're performing over time, you might have a criteria for how often you would need to requalify a certain type of supplier. And then another criteria that you can use to define the frequency for your requalification would be your number of batches that you source from the supplier over a given period of time. So these are some of the things that you can really look at while you are performing the risk assessments and then defining your frequencies for requalification. Obviously, a supplier who is high risk compared to a supplier that's low risk, you would have different frequencies for requalification or COA confirmation requalification. So, depending on the risk the supplier poses or the component poses, you will define these in your supplier qualification program. Now, one of the other criteria that, sometimes we don't think about, but this should definitely be included in your procedure for supplier qualification, is the disqualification piece, right? So we definitely want to include that once our suppliers are qualified, how do we really monitor their performance? Are there any KPIs? What are our scorecards looking like? What will we might be monitoring on our supplier basis? So all of that should be described in your procedure. And then based on that and the previous criteria that we just talked about, we should also have clauses around disqualification, because under certain circumstances, your component user may need to be considered to be disqualified. Some of the potential criteria that could lead to a supplier disqualification would include, supplier performance. So you might have done an audit or when you're doing COA confirmation tests and they have failing results, that could be an area that could lead to a supplier disqualification. Any type of legal or regulatory actions, such as consent decrees, warning letters, criminal prosecutions that a supplier might have against them that might warrant you to disqualify them, or any special cause events where you found the product to be adulterated or misbranded. So these are potential areas that you could talk about in your SOP, and then also talk about how you would be monitoring these, and then that could potentially lead to your disqualification of a component supplier. Okay, so that's generally the overview of your supplier qualification program. In the last 2 slides, we are going to talk about the FSVP compliance during this pandemic. Currently, the FDA will not enforce supplier verification requirements of on-site audit of food suppliers if other verification methods are used instead. So let's say you have a qualification SOP for your suppliers, and in that you do require an on-site audit. In the interim, the FDA has allowed for you to not do on-site audits if you have written justification for what are the other activities you might be doing in order to rely on your supplier COA. It might be that you might be testing all your lots, or you might be more vigilant in doing virtual audits. So whatever that is the case, it's acceptable as long as you have made that amendment to your procedure or that deviation, and you've captured it and you're following it to that point. So the 3 affected FSMA regulations that the interim policy is applicable to is the FSMA regulations, current good manufacturing practices, the hazard analysis, risk-based preventive controls for human, which is 21 CFR Part 111, subpart G, current good manufacturing practices, hazard analysis, and risk-based preventive controls for food for animals. That's 21 CFR Part 507. And then the foreign supplier verification program for importers of food for humans and animals, 21 CFR Part 1, subpart L. And that's what we referred to in the beginning of the slides, which is where we were required to have the qualified auditor, right? So obviously, if our program's talking about doing on-site audits, in the interim, the FDA is not enforcing that. The FDA Temporary Policy, it's called the Temporary Policy regarding preventive controls and FSVP on-site audit requirements during the COVID-19 public health emergency. We can find this. It's actually on the slides. It's a hyperlink. So if you click on it, it takes you to the policy. And I believe that we will be sharing this, or might have already shared the slides with you, that you can click onto and read at later at any point. So also just wanted to make another note is that the food safety plan or the FSVP program must be modified to incorporate the alternate activity or activities. So this is again, what I was alluding to before is if you have decided in the interim to do other things than the on-site audit, just make sure that you have a deviation written and that your modified procedures incorporate the new activities that you've selected to follow. Okay, and with that, that is the completion of our webinar. I will open to questions.
Great, thank you so much. Great presentation. So it looks like you're able to see some of the, you were able to see that some people were having trouble hearing. Are you able to see the questions? Would you like me to read you questions?
I think I see some of them.
Okay, okay.
All right, yeah, I think I can. So there's about 6, right? That's all I see right now.
Okay, there are, 6 there. So I'll let you take those. And then I see a few more in another area that I'll be able to read when you're finished.
Okay, perfect.
Great.
So the question that I see is, the first one is what about identity testing on non-compendial raw materials? So as I was mentioning earlier, identity testing is something that you cannot put under the reduced testing. You must always do identity testing on your components. Now, when you say that it's non-compendial, I think the issue is different here. We're not really talking about supplier CFA reliance. We're actually talking about selecting the right identity test methods. And for that, you know, there is quite a lot of resources that could be used to identify what could be your appropriate methods for your raw materials. But identity testing, again, is one thing that we cannot go down to reduced testing. We must always do that on all lots that we receive for all shipments. Okay, so second question that I see is raw material. All right, what if these are internal methods? Well, internal methods are acceptable as long as they are validated. So you can use compendial methods or you can develop internal methods. As long as they're validated test methods, you can use them to perform the identity testing, or for that matter, any of the other criterias under composition or strength or limits of potential contaminants. So those could be used. Okay, the other question I see is, would you consider a remote audit walkthrough with video acceptable in place of an in-person audit? Yes, absolutely. And that's actually one of the things quite a lot of the firms are doing, especially with this pandemic. It has opened up quite a different venue of like things that we didn't really think were possible, but these are very well accepted. Actually, you know, believe it or not, the FDA has been doing some virtual audits as well, you know, in various different industries. So it is very much acceptable. Just note that it's a lot more time consuming, even though it's virtual, but you're sitting in front of a computer and really looking at the document. So be prepared for that, but these are very much acceptable. Okay, the next one I see is, how many lots for confirmation testing is considered best practice? Well, it depends. It totally depends on what the material is. If you go back to, you know, it's not one approach for everything. So based on the risk of your component, you would want to decide how many lots you want to test. But in general, it's first 3 initial lots, or if you're only buying a very limited quantity, then you might want to do every single lot that you get. But in general, first 3 shipments that you get in, and then once per year doing the reconfirmation testing. Okay, the next one is, can we do reduced testing on purity of the material? Well, we might want to be a little bit more descriptive on which exact area. If you're talking about microbiological aspects under the purity, my recommendation would be, in the dietary ingredients, especially on botanicals, this is an area which you might not want to go to reduce testing, only because there are high risk components, and also conditions during shipping could impact. So that would be something that I would recommend that you do test on every lot that you receive. But again, if it's something synthetic and there is no high risk, going back to that risk-based approach, you can have a reduced plan. All right. Okay, so next one is regarding periodic requalification of a supplier. Is it acceptable to justify a periodic requalification if you receive a full audit report from the supplier certification body as a supplement to their current certificate that they provide, so long as it is defined in your SOP? So this is a question that's really specific to requalification, not initial qualification. And if you have done your initial qualification, and as you are going through the requalification process, let's say for the first time you had decided to do an audit, in a lot of the cases, if there hasn't been any change in their processes or systems or management during requalification, you might end up not doing an on-site audit. So to your question on, hey, if they provide us the exact report with details on what their observations were and what corrective actions they've taken, in addition to you doing an on-site audit and you're aware of them and what risk they stand in, then that's totally acceptable and you can do that. Again, it will go back to the risk that you have assessed with that supplier. If they're one of those low risk suppliers and they haven't had any changes in their processes and systems, that might not deem to have another audit then on site. The next one is, if we source a dietary ingredient from a supplier and we perform necessary testing before incorporating a dietary supplement, does the supplier have to be Part 117 compliant? Yes. So if you go back to one of the comments that I had made, that your suppliers must be in compliance with, at the minimum, the food GMPs, which is the 117. But there are main differences such as, specifications, some controls, production and process controls that when you see in 111, which is the dietary supplements. So you want to make sure that they are compliant with 117, but then they also have the right processes in place, or such as specifications, which, the 117 doesn't go into details of all of that. But if as one of the customers of them, you're going to create specifications, you would want to make sure that their material does meet those specifications and they agree to that. So those are some of the nuances that you want to make sure, because your suppliers might not even have those in the first place if they're following like 117. So just make sure that they understand what are the requirements of a dietary supplement manufacturer and that they're able to apply those to their facilities or their operations. Okay, the next one I see is, what if a vendor is not willing to provide any information? All right, that cracks me up a little bit. So yeah, that at this point, I would say you might want to question if that's the right supplier that you want to work with, because if they want your business, they should be willing to give you the information. And I would recommend that you partner with your sourcing team, who is really, that they're negotiating with on the bids and the contracts. And this should be one of the clear indications that in order to move forward, this is our process. And generally all suppliers are able to provide that information. So if you've got that one of those difficult suppliers, you definitely want to partner with your sourcing group and make sure they do that. Because if they want your business, they should be able to give you this information. I do understand from a practical purpose that, sometimes suppliers like a questionnaire, if you've got a 10-page questionnaire and they're putting that effort in there, they do want some sort of assurance that you're going to move forward. So again, it's always in your best favor to partner with your sourcing group and make sure the suppliers know what your onboarding process is and what the criteria is that they have to go through in order to be qualified. And then, on-site audit is always an option, right? So if they don't want to send you information, then they can either, like we were discussing, do a virtual audit and share the screen, and you can just look at the screen. If they don't want to send you documents, or just being on site is another option. Okay. Does 117 align with the GFSI audit schemes such as FSSC 22000, BRC, and SQF? It does. 117, the previous GMPs, 110, very different. So 117 does talk about your quality systems and does talk about your components or ingredients, let's say. So I would say they are pretty much in tone with the GFSI audit schemes. Not exactly the same, but I would say pretty much there. Yes, they are. Okay, all right, this is a long question, so I'm gonna read this. In the situation of a foreign manufacturer and a US distributor, what are the requirements for qualification? Okay, so foreign manufacturer, US distributor, is it acceptable to use the distributor qualification of the manufacturer, or do you need to do your own on-site audit as well? Do the regulations only apply if you're purchasing directly from a non-US supplier? So to answer your first question, and it's very common, this happens in the industry. If you are purchasing materials from a US distributor and the US distributor is purchasing from a foreign supplier, I have come across teams where a distributor is actually a very mature distributor and they actually have quality units within their teams who do this work, your supplier qualification work. And if you go ahead and audit your distributor, whether it's a desk audit and you review their procedures and maybe you ask for a couple of examples of their audits that they have done, that is totally acceptable. So you don't necessarily have to audit the distributor supplier. You can rely on that, but again, you have to make sure that they have the right teams, the right training, the right experience, their systems, their SOPs, whatever they might be. You review them and you assess them, and then you come up with the risk associated with that, but it's totally acceptable. Okay, Amy, these are the questions. Okay, maybe I'll go to the chat.
That's where I was headed.
All righty. Okay, so let's go to the beginning.
So we've got one here asking, when is it required to have an on-site audit of a supplier?
Sorry, can you repeat that?
When is it required to have an on-site audit of a supplier?
Well, this would be dependent based on your risk assessment, right? So let's say when you're doing a risk and you reviewed the supplier's SOP, you have, and we're talking about, again, very specific to dietary supplements, right? I'm not talking about the food GMPs, we're talking about dietary supplements. So in dietary supplements, the regulation doesn't state that you must always do that, right? So that's not what the reg is saying. The reg says that you must have a supplier qualification program, and then you should define what is that qualification program is. And what we went through was a general idea of what the best industry practice is. Usually your on-site audits, it's preferred. If you have the resources to do it, that's the ideal way to do it. Always do it for at least your component suppliers. But let's say if you don't, and you're trying to take an approach that's more practical and feasible with the resources you might have, you should have the SQQ, at least do the desk audit, and based on the desk audit, go and do the on-site audit for the suppliers that are high-risk suppliers. You might not want to do that for your low-risk suppliers. And medium, depending on what kind of risk there is, it might be a case-by-case basis.
Great. What are appropriate and realistic time intervals for supplier requalifications?
Great question. So generally for, again, it depends on how big your organization is, how many suppliers we're talking about and what resources you have. But anywhere from 3 years for like a high risk supplier, 2 to 3 years to maybe a 5-year for a low or a medium risk supplier.
And regarding components, does this also apply to packaging components?
No. So components, when FDA uses the word components in 21 CFR 111, they mean the dietary ingredients. So they don't mean packaging, which is your bottles and closures, right? Your caps. However, industry best practice, and we've come across situations where FDA has asked on how you've qualified those. So the recommendation is that you do include them in your supplier qualification program and qualify them. But your process might be different, where you probably just do an SQQ, and based on the risk that's posed by packagings or labels, or versus a bottle versus maybe a desiccant that you're purchasing, so dependent on that, you might not want to go to all those extra steps of on-site audits and all. But you should definitely include them as part of your supplier qualification program.
Great, thank you. Next question, is there room for emergency qualification clauses such as emergency supply issues or single supplier, etc.?
My assumption is that the question is, hey, if in an emergency we need to use a different supplier versus who we had qualified, what do we do? Yes, you can. Again, make sure your SOP talks about it, and that you might have different controls within your production and receiving, where you might want to make sure that you don't do any reliance on the CFA and you're testing everything, especially for the critical areas before you use the components. So yes, you are absolutely allowed to use a supplier in an emergency need, but make sure your SOP talks about what are the controls, what are the additional things that you would do in such a situation.
Perfect, thank you. If we are not doing reduced testing, but rather testing on everything on every lot, does the initial supplier verification process need to be as rigorous as presented?
Not really. No, it doesn't, because then you're really not doing any reliance on the CFA. You are testing every single lot, and based on the number of samples, how you collect from each shipment, then you're absolutely right. It doesn't have to be, because you've significantly reduced the risk based on your own processes that you have in place with regards to doing the quality control management of things. So no, it does not have to be.
And how big of a variance can there be for confirmation of COA?
Well, that should depend on the method variability. So if you are using the same method that the supplier is using, that's one of the big things that always happens. So you're using a different test method. You should really understand what the method variability is, and then based on that, build your this is the kind of discussion you wouldn't necessarily build in your supplier qualification, but you would build into your raw material testing SOP, where you would talk about results that you obtain and how much variance is allowed based on your test method variabilities.
Next question, if a raw material is being imported and the supplier provides the FSVP statement, is this sufficient? The supplier is the importer.
No. So they're providing a statement that they're compliant with FSVP, but the responsibility is on you. You have to make sure that you've done the due diligence to ensure that they are compliant. So them just providing a statement to you is not adequate at all. you must have that, FSVP / Supplier Qualification program to talk about how did you qualify them. And if you said we qualified them only based on this statement, that would not fly with the FDA.
And similar question, for a questionnaire sent to suppliers who buy from a third-party manufacturer, who should sign the questionnaire, the third-party vendor or you?
So it's similar to that whole distributor / distributor to a manufacturer relation, right? The distributor honestly cannot answer the questions that go in a questionnaire. The questionnaire really talks about specific processes at the site that's manufacturing it. So I don't think the distributor is the right party or would even have the information to answer those unless, like we said, if you're qualifying the distributor, that's a different story. And you're really focusing on only on this one piece of how they qualify their manufacturers, then you focus on that aspect of things. But if you want your questionnaires to be, very specific around the processes and systems and what's really happening at the manufacturing side, those should be filled by by the actual manufacturer, not the distributor.
And what do you recommend for suppliers that are located overseas, where particularly now with travel is a challenge? Is the questionnaire the only option, or what should they do in lieu of audits?
Well, one of the ones that we talked about earlier was, virtual audit, which is, you're on a computer, they can share their procedures, walk around on the facility with a camera. That's acceptable. That's one. Second, I can think of is, if you're really in the interim when you can't really follow to the T and do your audits, perhaps do full testing on the material that you're receiving. That's the most conservative approach. But those are the two options that could be incorporated.
Okay, similar question to before. If you can't get your supplier to return the questionnaire, this is a small company and so they're having trouble because the supplier is considering such a small amount ordered a waste of time. What is your recommendation?
That it goes back to the comment I made earlier. If they are small, you're still the brand owner, right? So you're making your product and you want to be sure that the components you're purchasing are of the right quality standards and safety standards. So I wouldn't say, well, they're having a hard time and they're small and you skip the process. No, perhaps that's where you can partner with them a little bit more. It's more of a different approach where you've got to talk to them and say, hey, this is important. This is what we need. How can we help you guide through it? And the second thing is, if they don't even understand the questionnaire, you might ask yourself the question if they're even the right partners for you. If they don't have the right expertise to produce the product for you or the component for you, are they even the right partner? That's a very first question. But if the second is about resources and trying to help, then maybe that's where you can just jump in. And, the easiest at that point is, in my personal opinion, what I've seen is sometimes getting the questionnaire out and having them fill out. You can always ask, because a lot of the suppliers do have their own questionnaires that they've filled out. So they don't have to keep on filling the same information for 10 different customers. Perhaps you can ask that if they're very short on resources and assess from there some of the questions you might have on your own questionnaire. It's another way to help them out, but still be compliant with the procedures that you have in place.
Do you recommend recording the virtual audit for evidence?
You don't have to do that, no, because obviously after the audit, you're going to have to write an audit report where you might discuss about what you reviewed, when you reviewed it, who reviewed it, any observations you saw from it. So that's your evidence. So you don't have to do the recording of the meeting. I don't even think the manufacturers would be okay with that. And you don't need it from an FDA perspective.
Thank you. We are just about out of time. We'll take one more question. That is, we have suppliers in different countries around the world. What is the best way to handle supplier audit programs, considering that we don't travel to all the countries to be in compliance?
Well, so first of all, right, the question is, do we even need to audit? Goes back to the risk. So when you put your suppliers, different suppliers providing you different type of materials could be on different risk levels. And maybe your procedure says that your low risk suppliers, you don't need to audit them at all. And you're just going to be doing the desk audit, right? Maybe for the other ones that you have that are on high risk, and with this situation happening at the moment, like we said, there's alternatives. You could do a virtual audit. It doesn't necessarily has to be on site. You could just connect via the computer and look at their process and look at their SOPs. Or the third, like we said, which involves a lot more monetary amount, which is to do full testing, right? So in order to avoid that and rely on the CFA, you would probably want to just do a virtual audit, or depending on risk, might not even need an audit.
Okay, perfect. Thank you all for so many questions. Thank you, Aisha, for a great presentation. We did record this. I saw a couple of people wondering if we had recorded it. We will post it on the EAS website within a few days. I did send the slides to everyone, so if you registered last minute and did not receive them, let me know and I'll be glad to send them to you. And with that, I will say thank you for joining us. We do have a dietary supplement GMP seminar coming up in late September. We have also a dietary supplement labeling seminar coming up in early October. So those are found on the EAS website. I'll include information on that in my follow-up email as well. And thanks everyone again. We look forward to seeing you at a future webinar or seminar, and have a great day. Thanks.
Thank you, everyone. Have a great day.